I will be asking Ben the interview questions, and Ben will be answering them as Noreen answered them for when we conducted our interview with her. She was Ben's first principal that he worked under, and so he has quite a bit of knowledge about the Prairie School District. So Ben, the very first question, tell me a little bit about yourself.
So Noreen's response was, this is her 22nd year in education, her 10th in administration. She's been a principal all the way, like you had said. I've worked for her as my first year of teaching. She was shared in Mount Vernon. She was the kindergarten through 8th grade principal at both the elementary school and the middle school. So that's where I worked with her. So she's had administration experience there, and then also at the secondary level at the high school, all out at Prairie. And now she just recently moved into her new position as the director of secondary education and innovation. And so she was more influential with the high school aspect of this change process that we're going to begin talking about. And so,
all right. So what year are you in on this change process, this one-to-one change process?
Prairie is currently in their 4th year of the process. They had started back in 2011, 2012, and really actually they had started the planning process back in 2010 to get ready for this whole entire process before they started. But they're currently in their 4th year with devices going through the whole implementation.
Okay. How did your district decide to go to the one-to-one approach?
Like she said, back in 2010, she was actually currently the principal out at Mount Vernon when I was there. So, but she had said that the district had started with the concept of just basically, it wasn't focusing on the devices necessarily. That wasn't the reason why they wanted to go to the one-to-one approach. It was more so how can they get to their higher goal of, they had a plan in motion, and that was trying to see how they could get their kids to a higher order and deeper thinking process, also how to engage the kids better. And then also part of their 10-year plan, which she said is now their 9-year plan, is to try and get to competency-based education. Okay. And the only way really to do that was to go with a one-to-one approach.
Mm-hmm. All right.
They started with the secondary level, which is where she came back in at when she became principal actually out at Prairie Edge, which is their alternative school. And so that was with the secondary area. And then she eventually moved into the high school aspect of it with her new job. So.
Okay. We have been talking about the conditions of change in our class. And so how did you go about getting your whole staff to become part of this change, wanting to be on board with this change?
Excuse me. And what she had said was, and this is something that I've experienced myself too, having my first college field placements when I was back at Kirkwood out at Prairie, but it wasn't really necessarily they were afraid of the change of, oh no, we're getting all these devices. It was more so, hey, we have them now, so now what? What do we do with them? They were very accepting of it, and that was the same thing with the parents, with the kids. Everybody was very accepting. It was more so just, we have these devices now, what do we do with them? And trying to figure out, they also spent a lot of time when they first started out with the nuts and bolts aspect, like making sure their Wi-Fi was working. They had a lot of electrical outlets accessible. So that way they had those parts out of the way, and then they could spend more time on just the implementation part, not necessarily
focusing on that.
Yeah, not worrying about we don't have enough plugins kind of a thing.
Or the Wi-Fi and stuff. Good.
Yep.
What was the most difficult part of the change and why?
It was more so what she had said. The difficult part, the majority of the culture out there, and this is kind of what both her and Craig talked about, was either you're with the team or you can choose to relocate and go somewhere else. So, but they said the most difficult part of the change was those who were not within the adoption process and trying to get them on board. But then also the other hard part was they have the devices, which wasn't the issue with the teachers who were willing to do it, but it was more so, again, we see, like, because they said they started at the high school level, but then when they were the elementary schools, that's the one aspect with a one central campus that college community has, is all the buildings are so close to each other. So I showed you the picture.
Yep.
And so it was more so everybody saw what was going on at the high school. And so all the elementaries and the middle school and the ninth grade building and the intermediate building were like, well, that's cool. Why can't we have that? So it was more so trying to make sure that you got everybody settled and trying to make sure that nobody was angry that these people have this, whereas this, we don't, kind of an aspect.
And the next question was going to be about convincing faculty, but according to what Noreen had talked about, they didn't really have to convince people. They just wanted what the neighboring schools had, which were still schools that in their district.
Yeah. And it was, and Prairie's very research based. So when they present the idea, whenever they present an idea, it's not just here it is, let's just go for it and see what happens. This is the research behind it. This is why we're doing it. So that way the staff know without a shadow of a doubt, hey, this is why, and this is why this is going to be a part of the culture of continuing to help kids learn, no matter if they're here or if they're going out to different places. So,
and Noreen also talked about the research that they did before they implemented this. Then they put that in a letter to parents, so parents even knew the research behind it. So they do feel strongly about that, which is important.
And they also had that in place before they even thought about getting the devices. They didn't even start thinking about getting devices until they had the, like she called it, the nuts and bolts. Yeah. And same thing with talking about systems thinking. They want to make sure that, because that's a big part of Prairie's culture, is systems thinking. And so with that, they wanted to make sure, and the parents already had that part on board, but they wanted to make sure that they see how this connects with the culture that they've already built, which the parents were totally fine with. And that's why they get so many people coming in and open enrolling, because they see what Prairie is doing out there. And they're not afraid of change, but they also are very due diligent about it. They know how they're planning everything out. There's not one thing that they don't just fly by the seat of their pants with, which is what I know a lot of parents that have talked to me about it out there, that I have friends still back in Cedar Rapids, say that they like, because they're very planned out. They have a system. They look at the way they're going to do it.
Yeah, she also talked about how big they are becoming, that they get about 100 new students every year. And so they are just growing and growing.
Which they just recently built a new elementary school 2 years ago, and now they're looking at building a whole nother intermediate building along with another possible elementary school to add on, because they keep, I know their class sizes are average around 25 to 28 kids per class. So that's why they're trying, and they're also currently looking at trying to add some more space at the high school too. So
good. The next question then was, now that you have gone through this major change in your school system, are there ways in which the teachers are held accountable for these new changes?
And this goes back to the culture that she and Craig have both talked about at Prairie, which goes to their whole aspect of they have a one clear goal, and they try and find the people who jump on with that one clear goal. They don't necessarily care if you're not the greatest with the technology. They just want you to at least try it. And and it goes back to the whole community aspect, how tight-knit they are out there. They see one group's doing it and they see how it affects their kids. And then it's more of the, I want that too kind of mindset. Because they were talking about how they send their teachers to, and not just like a couple teachers, they send 30, 40 teachers to different training sessions to make sure they got them on board and see how this would affect, like different Google workshops, because they went from having 20 teachers using Google Classroom to 340 by the end of the training session. So that was one aspect. And it's really more so the accountability part is built into the culture there. It's kind of an expectation. It's not, you can kind of choose whether or not you're going to do it. It's more so you see everybody else doing it And if you're not on board, you're probably going to have some parents saying, hey, my kid should be in that class because that teacher's doing that and this teacher's not.
Mm-hmm. We then ask, what kind of tech support does the school offer?
Yep. And she compared it a lot to MTSS. It's kind of how they go through any change process. They offer a lot of mini sessions after school. With the grant they recently got, they were able to hire some digital literacy trainers out there for each, and it's a couple at each building. It's not just 2 for the whole district. It's 2 at each building out there.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the people that they sent out to places like iTech. They've also sent other groups of teachers, but the digital literacy trainers, more specifically, we had talked in class about the fishbowl aspect
Mm-hmm.
of how they kind of have people sitting on the outside watching them teaching other teachers how to use this, but they call them lab classrooms. And so they have kids teaching the teachers how to use things, and also vice versa. It's very tight knit, and everybody is focused on the one goal of helping each other, which is a really strong aspect that they have out at Prairie.
Mm-hmm. Which is important.
Yeah.
Our next question, she had already answered our question was, does this seem to be enough, especially with reluctant staff members? And she talked again about how we really don't have the reluctant staff members.
Yep.
Everyone is just expected to work their hardest that they can.
Yep.
Our following question was, how did you go about involving and informing the parents of this change process?
Yep. And she had talked about, and this is something I know from my experience out there, that they're very parent oriented, very like any way they can find to get the parents involved. So they got them involved right away by sending out they use social media, not just email. They also were able to call some parents and sent a survey out, kind of a clarity survey out to all of the kids, staff, and parents. And again, like I said, they use a lot of social media to get parents involved, which got them a lot better reaction than just kind of sending a piece of paper home and saying, hey, here this is. Whereas they know with their clientele, they're a lot more likely to get parents to respond back on social media.
Mm-hmm.
So, but they did send the letters home, but they had training sessions with all the kids and the parents, kind of going back to that fishbowl model. With the lab classrooms, the parents are also involved with the lab classrooms that they have out there too. So it's everybody working together, all for one aspect.
Yep. And like I had mentioned before, she talked about how they sent home letters talking about the district's values first in the letters, and then also explained the research behind what they wanted to get implemented.
Mm-hmm.
Our next question was, how did you go about getting parents and students to attend the trainings for the change?
And it was more so, like she said, that culture of these people have it, so why can't we? It was more so the parents felt concerned that if they didn't do it, their kids were going to be left behind everybody else. And there were a lot of parents. She had referenced one parent who had talked to her about how this is totally fine with me because I deal with this myself in my job. And that's part of Prairie's whole goal that they have. Their district goals is preparing them for a 21st century job. So they have the backing of the parents and they have the backing of everybody with that one goal.
Absolutely. We asked her then what worked well during the process.
And she said, and again with Prairie, this is the one nice part that they have, is all the buildings are all next to each other with the one central campus. So the logistics aspect, they didn't have to worry about with other districts who are across the whole entire city, how they have to try and rush to all the different buildings that might be 20 minutes away to try and get somebody's internet to work. Whereas with them, it's all centrally located. So they were able to get that part down pat. And then, but then also with that, which kind of ties into our next question, did you want to go with that?
Sure. I was just going to mention that the problems that they had were solved so much quicker than where if they were all spread out. Our next question we had to ask her was, what didn't work well and what else does a staff need?
Yep. And what she had said, this was kind of the negative side of having a central campus. And that was that people could see, like they said, they started with the high school. And so all the high school teachers were like, yeah, we have this. But then the elementary, like Prairie Ridge, which is right next door to the high school, all the teachers there would see, hey, all these people have it. So why can't we have something to go with that? So it's more of the they have it mindset, making sure everybody has an equal opportunity. So that was, but they also use that as a positive to get the ball rolling of getting everybody on board with the process.
Yep. She also talked about how if they were, and this is a later question, but it also talked about how if they were to redo it, that they would try to have everyone involved earlier. So then that way they didn't have as much as the, well, why do they have it kind of feelings.
Yeah.
We asked her about how did you go about developing professional development sessions and opportunities for the staff to get accustomed with the devices.
And she had talked, and this is something that Craig had also talked, but she was more in charge of the high school aspect. But they have a lot of before school professional development trainings, like especially with new teachers every year. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of how they introduce the new teachers to the whole staff, is to get them all into a technology training at the same time. They have a few days before school, and then they also have a lot throughout the year, but then it's also building based. So some buildings also, like the intermediate building, and this is the other nice part of having everybody all together, she had said, was the intermediate building would have their own session and offered out to the rest of the district. And so if the rest of the district teachers wanted to join in, then they could just walk across the street and go join that too. So they had a lot of district level ones, but then they also, it's a very tiered leveled system. So they started out at the district, but then each building would then offer, if they found something that worked really well, then they would offer it to the whole district and say, hey, come on across the street and we can have a training session kind of aspect.
Mm-hmm. We asked then about the 5-year plan, which was what I had mentioned just a little bit ago. And she said, hopefully it would be just a 4-year phase, but.
Yep. Kind of like the 10-year process. She had talked about how it's now their 9-year process. She's very eager.
Go getter.
Yeah. She wants to get the ball rolling just because she cares so much about kids, which I know from when I worked with her back in Mount Vernon. But she's part of their 4-year phase for this process then is they're talking about building another intermediate building, another elementary school, adding on to the high school. And with that means adding on more teachers. And also, like you had talked about earlier, how the district keeps growing, how they have 100 students on average each year. They're projected to have that for the next 5 years, which would be another 500 students, and then also a good chunk of brand new staff that then they're going to have to get back on board. So that's part of their vision for that, is just to keep moving and then eventually keep moving for standards. They're working on standards-based grading right now, but eventually they're pushing for, in this next 4 years, possibly 5, is getting that competency-based learning where it brings in the student ownership and then making sure that they get their individual plans for every child within the district, not just a handful, and then hopefully push it to be a K-12 experience after they've gotten the devices out now, but they want to get that competency-based aspect throughout the district, not just starting at the high school level like they had said they had started with the device implementation. But they want to get that competency based. That's their whole central goal throughout this whole entire thing. Like I said at the beginning, is that competency based learning and the student ownership for it. So that is why they were going through this whole process, is because of that one central focal point of going towards competency based learning.
Yep. We then ask her, what, if any, barriers do you foresee in this process?
And she talked about the only barriers really was just the culture change, just going to implementing the better ways of using it, not focusing on the tool, but making sure, because they're very big on UBD. And so they use that with their lesson planning, but trying to help implement UBD along with the how to better use these tools to support their learning to then eventually go to that competency-based learning. That's the toughest part. The nuts and bolts part wasn't, because again, she had pointed out, because the tech department's just literally right across the street.
Yep.
So that's something that they didn't have to, and they spent all their time at the beginning front loading it with that aspect, so that way they could focus on all of the nitty gritty, as she always used to call it with me, kind of getting things going with the kids again, because she's very student oriented, she's very kid oriented.
Yeah, that the goal is that the tool isn't the end all be all, that it's just there to help, but really to get the students taking ownership of their own learning.
Yeah, that is her favorite quote.
Our final question for her was about asking if they could redo the process, what kind of changes would they make the second time? And earlier I had talked about how supporting more people earlier on in the process, but then she mentioned some other things.
Not just the high school, like she had said. But then she'd also talked about how that was also kind of a good starting point, just because this is such a huge change process. So she said there was kind of pluses and negatives with it, but she would definitely at least get more people involved in the beginning process. Maybe, again, still go with start out with the high school level teachers having the devices and then moving forward, but at least have the elementary people in the planning stages. And then also not getting caught up too much with the tech, even though she said that she also said going back, but this was something that's really hard to plan, is just she probably wouldn't go with the MacBook Air just because of how expensive those things are. But again, really it was more so they still didn't want to focus on the technology, but more so rather the implementation efforts. And that's, like she had said, getting more of the staff involved in the preparation for it before they started out, instead of just doing the high school level.
Yep. And she talked about how kids can bring their own devices now, because they're getting to the point where you want what you want, depending on whether it's the MacBook, depending on the Chromebook, people want what they want. So
Yep. Which was again, that was an aspect she and both Craig, who had kind of brought up of, again, if the kids bring their own tool, then they can use the money that, instead of supplying the device, they could then use it, because Noreen had talked about it right at the beginning of, if they could then use the money for other resources of helping the grade levels out, and not necessarily using all their money on the device. So that was one aspect that they had liked. And again, if the parents didn't feel comfortable with them using a school-owned device or using their own device, then they could then still purchase their own and bring their own device.
Yep.
So, but going through that whole process was the scaffolding, which she said was the best approach that you would have to do. And what she recommended, and both Craig recommended, was going through the process of making sure that you have a scaffold approach and work your way through it. So kind of going back to that systems thinking, how they think how the system works, and making sure that they have a starting point and ending point.
All right, that wrapped up our interview then with Noreen.
Yep. And that worked out pretty well. So, all right.
Thanks.